Corel. How are you doing? Sorry that was a bit delayed. Getting things all situated. Hope you've been having a good week. Awake. I'm going to switch over to the screen. Yeah, there we go. So welcome if you were watching on YouTube. Welcome to Storytime. And we are going to be continuing with the Poirot Investigates, which I had a lot of fun with the last one. There was a very interesting mystery, but the cheap flat one intrigued me. Oh, thank you so much for the cheers, for the bits, those corgi bits. I love those little corgis. Yeah, anyways, we're continuing with that, and I'll, of course, when I put them up on YouTube, I'll say what mysteries will be the ones that we're reading in the description. Just going to chat a little bit, and just look for the Meowing Maestro to go away, if you wanted to skip ahead to the story. Well, I hope it's not a bad thing that you're awake, that you just, been getting enough sleep and restful sleep, though I know that's been pretty tricky for some people. I know you've had troubles with it too. Maestro tends to wake me up rather more early than I want to wake up on my days off. Oh goodness, and it's 4 for you, so... Is it 4 or is it 5? I think it's 5. I'm not sure. Oh, let me see. I think that the emotes... Oh, you have access to, I think, the cheddar emotes? Okay, 4 p.m. I thought you were 2 hours ahead of me. I should have like a little spreadsheet. Yeah, 1600 hours. I remember when I was in Europe, of course, I think all places in Europe, or most places in Europe, do the 24-hour day. And so there was a 24-hour clock on one of the buses that we were taking. And it was such a new concept for almost all of us. So I got a total thrill when I saw it turn from 23:59 to 0 o'clock. My little Californian heart was so thrilled. Yeah, that was an interesting trip. It was, we went there with, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I kind of think in both sometimes. Like when I'm at work, I think in our usual 12-hour, but sometimes when I'm trying to figure out how far away, if it's like, well, I have to be up in 6 hours, and it's like 10 o'clock, and then I think, well, 16 o'clock, that's 4 o'clock. So it all depends on what I'm doing, that I'll sometimes think of the 24-hour clock. I think it's a good idea for, especially in the Army, it makes sense, in the armed forces, it makes sense to learn the 24-hour clock, because if you do go to another country, it's easy to shift over, and it also makes sense where, if you're portioning out your day, it's easier to figure out. So, yeah. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and start story time. So let me switch over, hide Maestro here. So the first mystery that we're reading today is The Mystery of Hunter's Lodge. After all, murmured Poirot, it is possible that I shall not die this time. Coming from a convalescent influenza patient, I hailed the remark as showing a beneficial optimism. I myself had been the first sufferer from the disease. Poirot, in his turn, had gone down. He was now sitting up in bed, propped up with pillows, his head muffled in a woolen shawl, and was slowly sipping a particularly noxious tisane, which I had prepared according to his directions. A tisane, by the way, is a tea made with herbs, herbal tea. But tea is technically not what it's called. His eyes rested with pleasure upon a neatly graduated row of medicine bottles, which adorned the mantelpiece. Yes, my little friend continued. Once more shall I be myself again, the great Hercule Poirot, the terror of evildoers. Figure to yourself, mon ami, that I have a little paragraph to myself in society gossip. But yes, here it is. Go it, criminals, all out, Hercule Poirot, and believe me, girls, he's some Hercules. Our own pet society detective can't get a grip on you. 'Cause why? 'Cause he's got la grippe himself. I laughed. Good for you, Poirot. You're becoming quite a public character, and unfortunately you haven't missed anything of particular interest during this time. And fortunately. That is true. The few cases I have had to decline did not fill me with any regret. Our landlady stuck her head in at the door. There's a gentleman downstairs. Says he must see Monsieur Poirot or you, Captain. Seeing as he was in a great to-do, and with all that quite the gentleman, I brought up his card. She handed me a bit of pasteboard. Mr. Roger Havering, I read. Poirot motioned with his head towards the bookcase, and I obediently pulled forth Who's Who. Poirot took it from me and scanned the pages rapidly. Second son of 5th Baron Windsor, married 1913, Zoe, 4th daughter of William Crabbe. I said. I rather fancy that's the girl who used to act at the Frivolity. Only she called herself Zoe Carisbrooke. I remember she married some young man about town just before the war. Would it interest you, Hastings, to go down and hear what our visitor's particular little trouble is? Make him all my excuses. Roger Havering was a man of about 40, well set up and of smart appearance. His face, however, was haggard, and he was evidently laboring under great agitation. Captain Hastings, you are Monsieur Poirot's partner, I understand. It is imperative that he should come with me to Derbyshire today. I'm afraid that's impossible, I replied. Poirot is ill in bed, influenza. His face fell. Dear me, that is a great blow to me. The matter on which you want to consult him is serious? My God, yes. My uncle, the best friend I have in the world, was foully murdered last night. Here in London? No, in Derbyshire. I was in town and received a telegram from my wife this morning. Immediately upon its receipt, I determined to come round and beg Monsieur Poirot to undertake the case. If you'll excuse me a minute, I said, and struck by the sudden idea. I rushed upstairs, and in a few brief words acquainted Poirot with the situation. He took any further words out of my mouth. I see. You want to go yourself, is it not so? Well, why not? You should know my methods by now. All I ask is that you should report to me fully every day, and follow implicitly any instructions I may wire you. To this I willingly agreed. Part 2. An hour later I was sitting opposite Mr. Havering in a first-class carriage in the Midland Railway, speeding rapidly away from London. To begin with, Captain Hastings, you must understand that Hunter's Lodge, where we are going, and where the tragedy took place, is only a small shooting box in the heart of the Derbyshire moors. Our real home is near Newmarket, and we usually rent a flat in town for the season. Hunter's Lodge is looked after by a housekeeper who is quite capable of doing all we need when we run down for an occasional weekend. Of course, during the shooting season, we take down some of our own servants from Newmarket. My uncle, Mr. Harrington Pace, as you may know, my mother was a Miss Pace of New York, has for the last 3 years made his home with us. He never got on well with my father or my elder brother, and I suspect that my being somewhat of a prodigal son myself rather increased than diminished his affection towards me. Of course, I am a poor man, and my uncle was a rich one. In other words, he paid the piper. But though extracting in many ways, he was not really hard to get on with, and we all three lived very harmoniously together. 2 days ago, my uncle, rather wearied with some recent gaieties of ours in town, suggested that we should run down to Derbyshire for a day or two. My wife telegraphed to Mrs. Middleton, the housekeeper, and we went down that same afternoon. Yesterday evening I was forced to return to town, but my wife and my uncle remained on. This morning I received this telegram. He handed it over to me. Come at once. Uncle Harrington murdered last night. Bring good detective if you can, but do come. Zoe. Then, as yet you know no details? No, I suppose it will be in the evening papers. Without doubt the police are in charge. It was about 3 o'clock, and when we arrived at the little station of Elmersdale, sorry, that was a full sentence. It was about 3 o'clock when we arrived at the little station of Elmersdale. From there, a 5-mile drive brought us to a small gray stone building in the midst of the rugged moors. A lonely place, I observed with a shiver. Havering nodded. I shall try and get rid of it. I never could live here again. We unlatched the gate and were walking up the narrow path to the oak door when a familiar figure emerged and came to meet us. Jap! I ejaculated. The Scotland Yard inspector grinned at me in a friendly fashion before addressing my companion. Mr. Havering, I think? I've been sent down from London to take care of this case, and I'd like a word with you, if I may, sir. My wife, I've seen your good lady, sir, and the housekeeper. I won't keep you a moment, but I am anxious to get back to the village now that I've seen all there is to see. I know nothing as yet as to what exactly, said Jap soothingly. But there are just 1 or 2 little points I'd like your opinion about all the same. Captain Hastings here, he knows me, and he'll go on up to the house and tell them you're coming. What have you done with the little man, by the way, Captain Hastings? He's ill in bed with influenza. Is he now? I'm sorry to hear that. Rather the case of the cart without the horse, you being here without him, isn't it? And on this rather ill-timed jest, I went on to the house. I rang the bell as Jap had closed the door behind him. After some moments it was opened to me by a middle-aged woman in black. Mr. Havering will be here in a moment, I explained. He's been detained by the inspector. I've come down with him from London to look into the case. Perhaps you can tell me briefly what occurred last night? Come inside, sir. She closed the door behind me, and we stood in the dimly lighted hall. It was after dinner last night, sir, that the man came. He asked to see Mr. Pace, sir, and seeing that he spoke the same way, I thought it was an American gentleman friend of Mr. Pace, and I showed him into the gun room, and then went to tell Mr. Pace. He wouldn't give any name, which of course was a bit odd, now I come to think of it. I told Mr. Pace, and he seemed puzzled like, but he said to the mistress, "Excuse me, Zoe, while I see what this fellow wants." He went off to the gun room, and I went back to the kitchen, but after a while I heard loud voices as if they were quarreling, and I came out into the hall. At the same time the mistress, she comes out too, and just then there was a shot, and then a dreadful silence. We both ran to the gun room door, but it was locked, and we had to go round to the window. It was open, and there inside was Mr. Pace, all shot and bleeding. What became of the man? We must have got away through the window, sir, before we got to it. And then? Mrs. Havering sent me to fetch the police. 5 miles to walk it is. Oh, they came back with me, and the constable, he stayed all night, and this morning the police gentleman from London arrived. What was this man like who called to see Mr. Pace? The housekeeper reflected. He had a black beard, sir, and he was about middle-aged, and had on a light overcoat. Beyond the fact that he spoke like an American, I didn't notice much about him. I see. Now I wonder if I can see Mrs. Havering. She's upstairs, sir. Shall I tell her? If you please. Tell her that Mr. Havering is outside with Inspector Japp, and that the gentleman he has brought back with him from London is anxious to speak to her as soon as possible. Very good, sir. I was in a fever of impatience to get all the facts. Japp had 2 or 3 hours start on me, and his anxiety to be gone made me keen to be close to at his heels. Mrs. Havering did not keep me waiting long. In a few minutes, I heard a light step descending the stairs, and looked up to see a very handsome young woman coming towards me. She wore a flame-colored jumper that set off the slender boyishness of her figure. On her dark head was a light little hat of flame-colored leather. Even the present tragedy could not dim the vitality of her personality. I introduced myself, and she nodded in quick comprehension. Of course, I've often heard of you and your colleague, Mr. Poirot. You have done some wonderful things together, haven't you? It was very clever of my husband to get you so promptly. Now, will you ask me questions? That is the easiest way, isn't it, of getting to know all you want to know about this dreadful affair? Thank you, Mrs. Haverings. Now, what time was it that this man arrived? Oh, must have been just before 9 o'clock. We had finished dinner, and we were sitting over our coffee and cigarettes. Your husband had already left for London? Yes, he went up by the 6:15. Did he go by car to the station, or did he walk? Our own car isn't down here. One came out from the garage in Elmersdale to fetch him in time for the train. Was Mr. Pace quite his usual self? Absolutely. Most normal in every way. Now, can you describe this visitor at all? I'm afraid not. Oh, hey, Swags. Glad you made it. We're in the early part of the mystery, so you didn't miss much. There has been a murder. And Poirot has the flu, so he's not actually here. Can you describe this visitor at all? I'm afraid not. I didn't see him. Mrs. Middleton showed him straight into the gun room, and then came to tell my uncle. What did your uncle say? He seemed rather annoyed, but went off at once. No, a man just arrived, and he said, my uncle has been murdered, please come with me. So, no, we're in the second part of the mystery. Let's see. Well, he seemed rather annoyed, went off at once. It was about 5 minutes later that I heard the sound of raised voices. I ran out into the hall and almost collided with Mrs. Middleton. Then we heard the shot. The gun-room door was locked on the inside, and we had to go right round the house to the window. Of course, that took some time, and the murderer had been able to get well away. My poor uncle, her voice faltered, had been shot through the head. I saw at once that he was dead. I sent Mrs. Middleton for the police. I was careful to touch nothing in the room, but to leave it exactly as I found it. I nodded approval. Now, as to the weapon, well, I can make it a guess at it, Captain Hastings. A pair of revolvers of my husband's were mounted upon the wall. One of them was missing. I pointed this out to the police, and they took the other one away with them. When they had extracted the bullets, I suppose they will know for certain. May I go to the gun room? Certainly. The police have finished with it, but the body has been removed. She accompanied me to the scene of the crime. At that moment, Havering entered the hall, and with a quick apology, his wife ran to him. I was left to undertake my investigations alone. I may as well confess at once that they were rather disappointing. In detective novels, clues abound, but here I could find nothing that struck me as out of the ordinary, except a large blood stain on the carpet where I judged the dead man had fallen. I explained everything with painstaking care, and took a couple of pictures of the room with my little camera, which I had brought with me. I also examined the ground outside the window, but it appeared to have been so heavily trampled underfoot that I judged it was useless to waste time over it. No, I had seen all that Hunter's Lodge had to show me. I must go back to Elmersdale and get into touch with Jap. Accordingly, I took leave of the Haverings and was driving off in the car that had brought me from the station. I found, sorry, froggy throat, sipping. I found Jap at the Matlock Arms, and he took me forthwith to see the body. Harrington Pace was a small, spare, clean-shaven man, typically American in appearance. He had been shot through the back of the head, and the revolvers had been discharged at close quarters. "Turned away for a moment," remarked Jap, "and the other fellow snatched up a revolver and shot him. The one Mrs. Havering handed over to us was fully loaded, and I suppose the other one was also. Curious what darn fools things, Curious what darn fool things people do. Fancy keeping 2 loaded revolvers hanging up on your wall." "What do you think of the case?" I asked, as we left the gruesome chamber behind us. "Well, I got my eye on Havering to begin with." "Oh, yes." Noting my exclamation of astonishment. "Havering has one or two shady incidents in his past. When he was a boy at Oxford, there was some funny business about the signature on one of his father's checks, all hushed up, of course. Then he's pretty heavily in debt now, and they're the kind of debts he wouldn't like to go to his uncle about, whereas you may be sure the uncle's will would be in his favor. Yes, I got my eye on him, and that's why I wanted to speak to him before he saw his wife. But their statements dovetail all right, and I'd been to the station, and there's no doubt whatever that he left by the 6:15. That gets up to London about 10:30. He went straight to his club, he says, and if that's confirmed all right, why, he couldn't have been shooting his uncle here at 9 o'clock in a black beard." "Oh, yes, I was going to ask you what you thought about that beard." Jap winked. "I think it grew pretty fast. Grew in the 5 miles from Elmersdale to Hunter's Lodge. Americans that I've met are mostly clean-shaven. Yes, it's almost Mr. Pace's American associate that will have to look for the murder. It's amongst. I questioned the gamekeeper first, and then her mistress, and their stories agreed all right. But I'm sorry Mrs. Havering didn't get a look at the fellow. She's a smart woman, and she might have noticed something that would get us on the track." I sat down and wrote a minute and a minute and lengthy account to Poirot. I was able to add various further items of information before I posted the letter. The bullet had been extracted and was proved to have been fired from a revolver identical with the one held by the police. Furthermore, Mr. Havering's movements on the night in question had been checked and verified, and it was proved beyond doubt that he had actually arrived in London by the train in question. And thirdly, a sensational development had occurred. A city gentleman living at Ealing on crossing Haven Green to get to the district railway station that morning had observed a brown paper parcel stuck between the railings. Opening it, he found that it contained a revolver. He handed the parcel over to the local police station, and before night it was proved to be the one we were in search of, the fellow to that given us, trying to figure out this sentence.
He handed the parcel over to the local police, and before night it was proved to be the one we were in search of, the fellow to that given us by Mrs. Havering. Oh, gotcha. The gun was the fellow to the gun that Mrs. Havering gave them. Gotcha. One bullet had been fired from it. All this I added to my report. A wire from Poirot arrived while I was at breakfast the following morning. Of course, black-bearded man was not Havering. Only you or Jap would have such an idea. Wire me description of housekeeper and what clothes she wore this morning. Same as Mrs. Havering. Do not waste time taking photographs of interiors. They are underexposed and not in the least artistic. I love him. He's funny. It seemed to me that Poirot's style was unnecessarily facetious. I also fancied he was a shade jealous of my position on the spot, with full faculties for handling the case. His request for a description of the clothes worn by the two women appeared to me to be simply ridiculous, but I complied as well as I, a mere man, was able to. At 11, a reply wire came from Poirot. Advise Jap arrest housekeeper before it is too late. Dumbfounded, I took the wire to Jap. He swore softly under his breath. He's the goods, Monsieur Poirot. If he says so, there's something in it, and I hardly noticed the woman. I don't know that I can go so far as arresting her, but I'll have her watched. We'll go up right away and take another look at her. But it was too late. Mrs. Middleton, that quiet, middle-aged woman who had appeared so normal and respectable, had vanished into thin air. Her box had been left behind. It contained only ordinary wearing apparel. There was no clue to her identity or as to her whereabouts. From Mrs. Havering we elicited all the facts we could. I engaged her about 3 weeks ago when Mrs. Emery, our former housekeeper, left. She came to me from Mrs. Snellbourne's agency in Mount Street, a very well-known place. I get all my servants from there. They sent several women to see me, but this Mrs. Middleton seemed much the nicest, and had splendid references. I engaged her on the spot and notified the agency of the fact. I can't believe that there was anything wrong with her. She was such a nice, quiet woman. The thing was certainly a mystery, whilst it was clear that the woman herself could not have committed the crime, since at the moment the shot was fired, Mrs. Havering was with her in the hall. Nevertheless, she must have had some connections with the murderer. Or why should she suddenly take to her heels and bolt? I wired the latest developments to Poirot and suggested returning to London and making inquiries at Snellbourne's agency. Poirot's reply was prompt. Useless to inquire at agency. They will never have heard of her. Find out what vehicle took her up to Hunter's Lodge when she first arrived there. Though mystified, I was obedient. The means of transport in Elmersdale were limited. The local garage had 2 battered Ford cars, and there were 2 station flys. None of these had been requisitioned on the date in question. Questioned, Mrs. Havering explained that she had given the woman the money for her fare down to Derbyshire, and sufficient to hire a car or fly or take her up to Hunter's Lodge. There was usually one of the Fords at the station on the chance of its being required. Taking into consideration the further fact that nobody at the station had noticed the arrival of a stranger, black-bearded or otherwise, on the fatal evening, everything seemed to point to the conclusion that the murderer had come to the spot in a car, which had been waiting near at hand to aid his escape, and that the same car had brought the mysterious housekeeper to her new post. I may mention that inquiries at the agency in London bore out Poirot's prognostication. No such woman as Mrs. Middleton had ever been on their books. They had received the Honourable Mrs. Havering's application for a housekeeper, and had sent her various applicants for the post. When she sent them the engagement fee, she omitted to mention which woman she had selected. Somewhat crestfallen, I returned to London. I found Poirot established in an armchair by the fire in a garish red dressing-gown. He greeted me with much affection. "Oh, mon ami Hastings, but how glad I am to see you. Veritably, I have for you a great affection. And you have enjoyed yourself? You have run to and fro with the good Jap? You have interrogated and investigated to your heart's content?" "Poirot," I cried, "the thing's a dark mystery, will never be solved. It is true that we are not likely to cover ourselves with glory over it. No, indeed. It's a hard nut to crack. Oh, as far as that goes, I am very good at cracking the nuts. A veritable squirrel. It is not that which embarrasses me. I know well enough who killed Mr. Harrington Pace." "No? How did you find out?" "Oh, and hello, Chaotic. Good to see you." "Oh, thank you, and I wish the same to you. Do tell me in the Discord what you guys are having." Okay, let's see. "Your illuminating answers to my wires supplied me with the truth. You see, Hastings, let us examine the facts methodically and in order. Mr. Harrington Pace is a man with a considerable fortune, which at his death will doubtless pass to his nephew. Point number 1. His nephew is known to be desperately hard up. Point number 2. His nephew is also known to be, shall we say, a man of rather loose moral fibre. Point number 3. But Roger Havering is proved to have journeyed straight up to London. Précisément. And therefore, as Mr. Havering left Elmersdale at 6:15, and since Mr. Pace cannot have been killed before he left, or the doctor would have spotted the time of the crime as being given wrongly when he examined the body, we conclude quite correctly that Mr. Havering did not shoot his uncle. But there is a Mrs. Havering, Hastings." "Impossible! The housekeeper was with her when the shot was fired." "Ah, yes, the housekeeper. But she has disappeared." "She will be found?" "I think not. There is something peculiarly elusive about that housekeeper. Don't you think so, Hastings? It struck me as once." "She played her part, I suppose, and then got out in the nick of time." "And what was her part?" "Well, presumably to admit her confederate, the black-bearded man. Oh, I have an idea of what possibly happened. We'll see." "Oh, no, that was not her part. Her part was what you have just mentioned, to provide an alibi for Mrs. Havering at the moment the shot was fired. And no one will ever find her, mon ami, because she does not exist. There's no such person, as your so great Shakespeare says." "It was Dickens," I murmured, unable to suppress a smile. "But what do you mean, Poirot?" "I mean that Zoe Havering was an actress before her marriage, that you and Jap only saw the housekeeper in a dark hall, a dim middle-aged figure in black with a faint subdued voice, and finally that neither you nor Jap, nor the local police whom the housekeeper fetched, ever saw Mrs. Middleton and her mistress at one and the same time. It was child's play." Where am I? I suddenly lost my place. Here we go. "It was child's play for that clever and daring woman. On the pretext of summoning her mistress, she runs upstairs, slips on a bright jumper and a hat with black curls attached, which she jams down over the grey transformation. A few deft touches, and the makeup is removed. A slight dusting of rouge, and the brilliant Zoe Havering comes down with her clear, ringing voice. Nobody looks particularly at the housekeeper. Why should they? There is nothing to connect her with the crime. So she, too, has an alibi. Hey, UK, so good to see you. But the revolver that was found at Ealing, Mrs. Havering could not have placed it there. No, that was Roger Havering's job, but it was a mistake on their part. It put me on the right track. A man who has committed murder with a revolver, which he found on the spot, would fling it away at once. He would not carry it up to London with him. No, the motive was clear. The criminals wished to focus the interest of the police on a spot far removed from Derbyshire. They were anxious to get the police away as soon as possible from the vicinity of Hunter's Lodge. Of course, the revolver found at Ealing was not the one with which Mr. Pace was shot. Roger Havering discharged one shot from it, brought it up to London, went straight to his club to establish his alibi, then went quickly out to Ealing by the district, a matter of about 20 minutes only, placed the parcel where it was found, and so back to town. That charming creature, his wife, quietly shoots Mr. Pace after dinner. You remember he was shot from behind. Another significant point that. Reloads the revolver and puts it back in its place, and then starts off with her desperate little comedy. It's incredible, I muttered, fascinated, and yet it is true. Yes, sir, my friend, it is true. But to bring that precious pair to justice, that is another matter. Well, Jap must do what he can. I have written him fully, but I very much fear, Hastings, that we shall be obliged to leave them to fate, or le bon Dieu, whichever you prefer. The wicked flourish like a green bay tree, I reminded him. But at a price, Hastings. Always at a price. Croyez-moi. I think that's believe me. Poirot's forebodings were confirmed. Jap, though convinced of the truth of his theory, was unable to get together the necessary evidence to ensure conviction. Mr. Pace's huge fortune passed into the hands of his murderers. Nevertheless, Nemesis did overtake them, and when I read in the paper that the Honorable Roger and Mrs. Havering were amongst those killed in the crashing of the air mail to Paris, I knew that justice was satisfied. I'm going to take a little break between the short stories, get caught up in chat. Oh, and I'm sorry, I just now noticed the host. Thank you so much for the host, UK. I hope you're having a good day. Or is it morning for you? I think yes, it is morning for you. I always get a little muddled there. Yeah, thank you for the happy Turkey Day swags. I know you had your Thanksgiving last month. But yeah, remind me of what you guys have on your Thanksgivings. Like, is there a dish that says universally enjoyed, or kind of an obligatory Thanksgiving thing, kind of like turkey is kind of an obligatory Thanksgiving thing here? Oh, thank you. Yeah, I decided Agatha Christie I always sort of picture with English countryside, so I did a Google search for English countryside and free use, and I got this image, and I'm like, that seems like an Agatha Christie setting. So even though some of it takes place in the heart of the city, I like having this scenery up. Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much for stopping by and hanging out with us. Who are you modding for? Oh, and of course, I lost my end place. Of course, I must give you a little shout out. So, guys, I think you all know UK, but if you don't, she is wonderful. She's very friendly, nice and chill, and, yeah. Oh, okay. Sure thing. Storytime's like the perfect thing to have in the background, I always think. I know, but I want to. I like to support my fellow streamers. So let me take a little break just to freshen up my voice. Yeah, getting my place back. There we go. All right. Getting back to the story. Story 5. The $1 Million Bond Robbery.
Oh, thank you so much for the bits. Enjoy your lurk. Enjoy your stream that you're modding. And I love that cute little rainbow unicorn. All right. Story 5. The $1 Million Bond Robbery. What a number of bond robberies there have been lately, I observed one morning, laying aside the newspaper. Poirot, let us forsake the science of detection and take to crime instead. Oh, you are on the, how do you say it, get-rich-quick tack, mon ami? Well, look at this last coup, the $1 million worth of Liberty bonds, which the London and Scottish Bank were sending to New York, and which disappeared in such a remarkable manner on board the Olympia. If it were for the mal de mer and the difficulty of practicing the so excellent method of lagerrière, it is a longer time than the few hours of crossing the Channel. I should delight to voyage myself on one of these big liners, murmured Poirot dreamily. Yes, indeed, I said enthusiastically. Some of them must be perfect palaces. The bathing, swimming baths, the lounges, the restaurant, the palm courts. Really, it must be hard to believe that one is on the sea. Me, I always know when I am on the sea, said Poirot sadly, and all those bagatelles that you enumerate, they say nothing to me. But, my friend, consider for a moment the geniuses that travel as it were incognito. On board these floating palaces, as you so justly call them, one would meet the élite, the haute noblesse of the criminal world. I laughed. So that's the way your enthusiasm runs. You would have liked to cross swords with the man who sneaked the Liberty bonds. The landlady interrupted us. A young lady wants to see you, Mr. Poirot. Here's her card. The card bore the inscription, Miss Esme Farquhar. And Poirot, after diving under the table to retrieve a stray crumb and putting it carefully in the wastepaper basket, nodded to the landlady to admit her. In another minute, one of the most charming girls I have ever seen was ushered into the room. She was perhaps about 25, with big brown eyes and a perfect figure. She was well dressed and perfectly composed in manner. Sit down, I beg of you, mademoiselle. This is my friend, Captain Hastings, who aids me in my little problems. I'm afraid it is a big problem I have brought you today, Monsieur Poirot, said the girl, giving me a pleasant bow as she seated herself. I dare say you have read about it in the papers. I am referring to the theft of Liberty bonds on the Olympia. Some astonishment must have shown itself on Poirot's face, for she continued quickly, You are doubtless asking yourself, what have I to do with a grave institution like the London and Scottish Bank? In one sense, nothing. In another sense, everything. You see, Monsieur Poirot, I am engaged to Mr. Philip Ridgway. Aha! And Mr. Philip Ridgway was in charge of the bonds when they were stolen. Of course, no actual blame can attach to him. It was not his fault in any way. Nevertheless, he is half distraught over the matter, and his uncle, I know, insists that he must carelessly have mentioned having them in his possession. It is a terrible setback to his career. Who is his uncle? Mr. Vavasour, joint general manager of the London and Scottish Bank.
Suppose, Mrs. Farquhar, that you recount to me the whole story? Very well. As you know, the bank wished to extend their credits in America, and for this purpose decided to send over $1 million in Liberty bonds. Mr. Vavasour selected his nephew, who had occupied a position of trust in the bank for many years, and who was conversant with all the details of the bank's dealings in New York, to make the trip. The Olympia sailed from Liverpool on the 23rd, and the bonds were handed over to Philip on the morning of that day by Mr. Vavasour and Mr. Shaw, the two joint general managers of the London and Scottish Bank. They were counted, enclosed in a package, and sealed in his presence, and he then locked the package at once in his portmanteau. Portmanteau with an ordinary lock? No, Mr. Shaw insisted on a special lock, having fitted it to it by hubs. Philip, as I say, placed the package at the bottom of the trunk. It was stolen just a few hours before reaching New York. A rigorous search of the whole ship was made, but without result. The bonds seemed literally to have vanished into thin air. Poirot made a grimace. But they did not vanish absolutely, since I gather that they were sold in small parcels within half an hour of the docking of the Olympia. Well, undoubtedly, the next thing is for me to see Mr. Ridgway. I was about to suggest that you should lunch with me at the Cheshire Cheese. Philip will be there. He is meeting me, but does not know that I have been consulting you on his behalf. We agreed to this suggestion readily enough and drove there in a taxi. Mr. Philip Ridgway was there before us, and looked somewhat surprised to see his fiancée arriving with two complete strangers. He was a nice-looking young fellow, tall and spruce, with a touch of graying hair at the temples, though he could not have been much over 30. Miss Farquhar went up to him and laid her hand on his arm. "You must forgive me acting without consulting you, Philip," she said. "Let me introduce you to Monsieur Hercule Poirot, of whom you must often have heard, and his friend Captain Hastings." Ridgway looked very astonished. "Of course I have heard of you, Monsieur Poirot," he said, as he shook his hands, "but I had no idea that Esme was thinking of consulting you about our trouble." "I was afraid that you would not let me do it, Philip," said Miss Farquhar meekly. "So you took care to be on the safe side," he observed with a smile. "I hope Monsieur Poirot will be able to throw some light on this extraordinary puzzle, for I confess frankly that I am nearly out of my mind with worry and anxiety about it." Indeed, his face looked drawn and haggard, and showed only too clearly the strain under which he was laboring. "Well, well," said Poirot, "let us lunch, and over lunch we will put our heads together and see what can be done. I want to hear Mr. Ridgway's story from his own lips." Whilst we discussed the excellent steak and kidney pudding of the establishment, Philip Ridgway narrated the circumstances leading to the disappearance of the bonds. His story agreed with that of Miss Farquhar in every particular. When he had finished, Poirot took up the thread with a question. "What exactly led you to discover that the bonds had been stolen, Mr. Ridgway?" He laughed rather bitterly. "The thing stared me in the face, Monsieur Poirot. I couldn't have missed it. My cabin trunk was half out from under the bunk, and all scratched and cut about where they tried to force the lock. But I understood that it had been opened with a key?" "That's so. They tried to force it, but couldn't, and in the end they must have got it unlocked somehow or other." "Curious," said Poirot, his eyes beginning to flicker with a green light I knew so well. "Very curious. They waste much time trying to prise it open, and then, sapristi, they find that they have the key all the time, for each of Hub's locks are unique. That's just why they couldn't have had the key. It never left me day or night." "You are sure of that?" "I can swear to it. And besides, if they had the key, or a duplicate, why should they waste time in trying to force an obviously unforceable lock?" Ah, there is exactly the question we are asking ourselves. I venture to prophesy that the solution, if we ever find it, will hinge on that curious fact. I beg of you not to assault me if I ask you one more question. Are you perfectly certain that you did not leave the trunk unlocked? Philip Ridgway merely looked at him, and Poirot gesticulated apologetically. Ah, but these things can happen, I assure you. Very well. The bonds were stolen from the trunk. What did the thief do with them? How did he manage to get ashore with them? Ah, cried Ridgway, that's just it. How? Word is passed to the customs authority, and every soul that left the ship was gone over with a tooth comb. And the bonds, I gather, made a bulky package? Certainly they did. They could hardly have been hidden on board, and anyway, we know they weren't, because they were offered for sale within half an hour of the Olympia's arrival, long before I got the cables going and the numbers sent out. One broker swears he bought them. He brought them over. One broker swears he bought some of them even before the Olympia got in, but you can't sell bonds by wireless. Not by wireless, but did any tug come alongside? Only the official ones, and that was after the alarm was given when everyone was on the lookout. I was watching out myself for their being passed over to someone that way. My God, Monsieur Poirot, this thing will drive me mad. People are beginning to say I stole them myself. But you also were searched on landing, weren't you? Asked Poirot gently. Yes. The young man stared at him in a puzzled manner. You do not catch my meaning, I see, said Poirot, smiling enigmatically. Now I should like to make a few inquiries at the bank. Ridgway produced a card and scribbled a few words on it. Send this in, and my uncle will see you at once. Poirot thanked him, bade farewell to Miss Farquhar, and together we started out for Threadneedle Street in the head office of the London and Scottish Bank. On production of Ridgway's cards, we were led through the labyrinth of counters and desks, skirting paying in clerks and paying out clerks, and up to a small office on the first floor where the joint general managers received us. They were two grave gentlemen who had brown-gray in the service of the bank. Who had grown gray in the service of the bank, that's what it is. Mr. Vavasour had a short white beard. Mr. Shaw was clean-shaven. I understand you are strictly a private inquiry agent, said Mr. Vavasour. Quite so, quite so. We have, of course, placed ourselves in the hands of Scotland Yard. Inspector McNeil has charge of the case. A very able officer, I believe. I am sure of it, said Poirot politely. You will permit a few questions on your nephew's behalf about this lock. Who ordered it from Hubbs? I ordered it myself, said Mr. Shaw. I would not trust to any clerk in the matter. As to the keys, Mr. Ridgway had one, and the other two are held by my colleague and myself. And no clerk has had access to them? Mr. Shaw turned inquiringly to Mr. Vavasour. I think I am correct in saying that they have remained in the safe where we placed them on the 23rd, said Mr. Vavasour. My colleague was unfortunately taken ill a fortnight ago. In fact, on the very day that Philip left us, he is only just recovered. Severe bronchitis is no joke to a man of my age, said Mr. Shaw ruefully. But I'm afraid Mr. Vavasour has suffered from the hard work entailed by my absence, especially with his unexpected worry coming on top of everything. Poirot asked a few more questions. I judged that he was endeavoring to gauge the exact amount of intimacy between uncle and nephew. Mr. Vavasour's answers were brief and punctilious. That's a word. His nephew was a trusted official of the bank and had no debts or money difficulties that he knew of. He had been entrusted with similar missions in the pair. Finally, we were politely bowed out. "I am disappointed," said Poirot as we emerged from the street. "You hoped to discover more?" "They were such stodgy old men." "It is not their stodginess that disappoints me, mon ami. I do not expect to find a bank manager, a keen financier with an eagle glance, as your favorite works of fiction put it. No, I am disappointed in the case. It is too easy." "Easy?" "Yes, do you not find it yourself almost childishly simple?" "You know who stole the bonds?" "I do." "But then we must... Why? Do not confuse and fluster yourself, Hastings. We're not going to do anything at present." "But why? What are you waiting for?" "For the Olympia. She is due on her return trip from New York on Tuesday." "But if you know who stole the bonds, why wait? He may escape." "To a South Sea island where there is no extradition? No, mon ami. He would find life very uncongenial there. As to why I wait, eh bien, to the intelligence of Hercule Poirot, the case is perfectly clear. But for the benefit of others, not so greatly gifted by the good God, the Inspector MacNeil, for instance, it would be as well to make a few inquiries to establish the facts. One must have consideration for these less gifted than oneself." "Good Lord, Poirot! Do you know, I'd give a considerable sum of money to see you make a thorough ass of yourself. Just for once. You're so confoundedly conceited." "Do not enrage yourself, Hastings. In verite, I observe that there are times when you almost detest me. Alas, I suffered the penalties of greatness." The little man puffed out his chest and sighed so comically that I was forced to laugh. Tuesday saw us speeding to Liverpool in a high-class carriage of the L&N.W.R. Poirot had obstinately refused to enlighten me as to his suspicions, his certainties. He contented himself with expressing surprise that I, too, was not equally au fait with the situation. I disdained to argue, and entrenched my curiosity behind a rampart of pretended indifference. Once arrived at the quay alongside which lay the great transatlantic liner, Poirot became brisk and alert. Our proceedings consisted in interviewing 4 successive stewards and inquiring after a friend of Poirot's who had crossed to New York on the 23rd. An elderly gentleman wearing glasses, a great invalid, hardly moving out of his cabin. A description appeared to tally with one Mr. Ventnor, who had occupied the cabin C-24, which was not that of Philip Ridgway. Although unable to see how Poirot had deduced Mr. Ventnor's existence and personal appearance, I was keenly excited. "Tell me," I cried, "was this gentleman one of the first to land when you got to New York?" The steward shook his head. "No, indeed, sir, he was one of the last off the boat." I retired crestfallen and observed Poirot grinning at me. He thanked the steward. A note changed hands, and we took our departure. "It's all very well," I remarked heatedly, "but that last answer must have damned your precious theory, grin as you please." "As usual, you see nothing, Hastings. That last answer is, on the contrary, the coping stone of my theory." I flung up my hands in despair. "I give it up." Part 2. When we were in the train speeding towards London, Poirot wrote busily for a few minutes, sealing up the result in an envelope. "This is for the good Inspector MacNeil. We will leave it at the Scotland Yard in passing, and then to the Rendezvous restaurant, where I have asked Miss Esme Farquhar to do us the honor of dining with us." "What about Ridgway?" "What about him?" asked Poirot with a twinkle. "Why, you surely don't think... You can't... The habit of incoherence is growing upon you, Hastings. As a matter of fact, I did think. If Ridgway had been the thief, which was perfectly possible, the case would have been charming, a piece of neat methodical work. But not so charming for Miss Farquhar. Possibly you are right. Therefore, all is for the best. Now, Hastings, let us review the case. I can see that you are dying to do so. The sealed package is removed from the trunk and vanishes, as Miss Farquhar puts it, into thin air. We will dismiss the thin air theory, which is not practicable at the present stage of science, and consider that it is likely to have become of it. What is to become of it? Everyone arrests the incredulity of its being smuggled ashore. Yes, but you may know, Hastings. I do not. I take the view that since it has seemed incredible, it was incredible. Two possibilities remain. It was hidden on board, also rather difficult, or it was thrown overboard. With a cork on it, do you mean? Without a cork. I stared. But if the bonds were thrown overboard, they couldn't have been sold in New York. I admire your logical mind, Hastings. The bonds were sold in New York, therefore they were not thrown overboard. You see where that leads us? Where we were when we started. Jamais de la vie. If the package was thrown overboard and the bonds were sold in New York, the package could not have contained the bonds. Is there any evidence that the package did contain the bonds? Remember, Mr. Ridgway never opened it from the time it was placed in his hands in London. Yes, but then... Poirot waved an impatient hand. Permit me to continue. The last moment that the bonds are seen as bonds is in the office of the London and Scottish Bank on the morning of the 23rd. They reappear in New York half an hour after the Olympia gets in, and according to one man whom nobody listens to, actually before she gets in. Supposing then that they have never been on the Olympia at all. Is there any other way they could get to New York? Yes, the Gigantic leaves Southampton on the same day as the Olympia, and she holds the record for the Atlantic. Mailed by the Gigantic, the bonds would be in New York the day before the Olympia arrived. All is clear, the case begins to explain itself. The sealed packet is only a dummy, and the moment of its substitution must be in the office in the bank. It would be an easy matter for any of the three men present to have prepared a duplicate package, which could be substituted for the genuine one. Très bien. The bonds are mailed to a confederate in New York, with instructions to sell as soon as the Olympia is in, but someone must travel on the Olympia to engineer the supposed moment of robbery. But why? Because if Ridgway merely opens the packet and finds it is a dummy, suspicion flies at once to London. No, the man on board in the cabin next door does his work, pretends to force the lock in an obvious manner so as to draw immediate attention to the theft, really unlocks the trunk with a duplicate key, throws the package overboard, and waits until the last to leave the boat. Naturally, he wears glasses to conceal his eyes, and is an invalid since he does not want to run the risk of meeting Ridgway. He steps ashore in New York and returns by the first boat available. But who? Or which was he? The man who had a duplicate key, the man who ordered the lock, the man who has not been severely ill with bronchitis at his home in the country. Enfin, the stodgy old man, Mr. Shaw. There are criminals in high places sometimes, my friends. Ah, here we are, mademoiselle. I've succeeded. You permit? And beaming, Poirot kissed the astonished girl lightly on either cheek. I wonder if we could possibly read 2 more stories today, because that only took an hour, and that was 2 stories. So I'm really quickly going to check how many pages we have. So let's see, that was about 30 pages.
Yeah, if we did 2 more stories, that would be about 40 pages, which is doable. We'll run a little over, but that's all right. If it's all right with you guys, I don't mind. I do, yes. Let me get Maestro up here. There we go, so people know I'm talking. Yes, that is the link to the playlists, and I always save my Storytime streams in the playlist. Oh, that's a good idea. That's actually one of the reasons why I chose 2 o'clock my time, because that's when a lot of people in Europe are going to sleep, and I thought that'd be a nice thing to send them off to sleep. And it's in the middle of the day for the people in America, so people on the west or on the East Coast, like the kids would be getting home from school, or the people would be getting home from work. Could be something nice, little something to wind down. And then of course people in Australia are just getting up. Maybe a nice little thing to send them in the morning. Thank you. Yeah. And I figure, I've watched serialized things on YouTube, and it's always frustrating. Okay, where's the next video? So yeah, exactly. And, it's nice to have the playlist thing so you can find the playlist, see where you left off, and continue like that. So I'm glad that they have that feature. It's definitely one thing I really appreciate on YouTube. Though, of course, with the affiliate agreement, they do ask that affiliates, or not ask, it is required that you wait 24 hours to post things on YouTube after the stream, so that they get like a whole day of priority, rights to it, pretty much. So now I wait a day before I put them up on YouTube, and then save them on the playlist. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and hide Maestro again. We're going to continue. Yeah, I luckily thought to skim things, read things a bit more closely when I signed the affiliate thing, when I accepted that. And I saw that, and it's like, that is a really good thing to know. Oh, which emote did you unlock? I want to see. I think you have access to the cheddar cat treat, I think. I don't know if you have access to the chicken. Yeah, cheddar and chicken. Or no, that's salmon and chicken. Oh, beef was the other one. Yeah, I decided to theme my cat treats. Salmon is the highest because that's what my cats like. They are really into fishy stuff. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and continue. Ooh, I just noticed now my subscriber badge now has 3 colored toe beans. So excited. Story number 6. The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb. I've always considered that one of the most thrilling and dramatic of the many adventures I have shared with Poirot was that of our investigation into the strange series of deaths which followed upon the discovery of opening the tomb of King Menhir. Oh, thank you. I had fun designing them. Hard upon the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun by Lord Carnarvon? Haha. Lord Carnarvon, Sir Lord John Willard, and Mr. Bleibner. Yeah. I'm going to start that paragraph again. That was a lot of stumbling. Hard upon the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun by Lord Carnarvon, Sir John Willard and Mr. Bleibner of New York pursued their excavations not far from Cairo, in the vicinity of the pyramids of Giza. some unexpectedly on a series of funeral chambers. Came unexpectedly on a series of funeral chambers. The greatest interest was aroused by their discovery. The tomb appeared to be that of King Menhera, one of those shadowy kings of the 8th dynasty, when the old kingdom was falling to decay. Little was known about this period, and the discoveries were fully reported in the newspapers. An event soon occurred which took a profound hold on the public mind. Sir John Willard died quite suddenly of heart failure. The more sensational newspapers immediately took the opportunity of reviving all the old superstitious stories connected with the ill luck of certain Egyptian treasures. The unlucky mummy at the British Museum, that hoary old chestnut, was dragged out with fresh zest, was quietly denied by the museum, but nevertheless enjoyed all its usual vogue. A fortnight later, Mr. Bleibner died of acute blood poisoning, and a few days afterwards a nephew of his shot himself in New York. The curse of Menhera was the talk of the day, and the magic power of dead and gone Egypt was exalted to a fetish point. It was then that Poirot received a brief note from Lady Willard, widow of the dead archaeologist, asking him to go and see her at her house in Kensington Square. I accompanied him. Lady Willard was a tall, thin woman dressed in deep mourning. Her haggard face bore eloquent testimony to her recent grief. "It is kind of you to have come so promptly, Monsieur Poirot." "I am at your service, Lady Willard. You wish to consult me." "You are, I am aware, a detective, but it is not only as a detective that I wish to consult you. You are a man of original views, I know. You have imagination, experience of the world. Tell me, Monsieur Poirot, what are your views on the supernatural?" Poirot hesitated for a moment before he replied. He seemed to be considering. Finally he said, "Let us not misunderstand each other, Lady Willard. It is not a general question that you are asking me there. It has a personal application, was it not? You are referring obliquely to the death of your late husband." "That is so," she admitted. So many apologies. "You want me to investigate the circumstances of his death?" "I want you to ascertain for me exactly how much is newspaper chatter and how much may be said to be founded on fact. 3 deaths, Monsieur Poirot, each one explicable taken by itself, but taken together surely an almost unbelievable coincidence, and all within a month of the opening of the tomb. It may be mere superstition, it may be some potent curse from the past that operates in ways undreamed of by modern science. The fact remains 3 deaths. And I am afraid, Monsieur Poirot, horribly afraid, it may not yet be the end." "For whom do you fear?" "For my son. When the news of my husband's death came, I was ill. My son, who was just come down from Oxford, went out there. He brought the body home, but now he has gone out again in spite of my prayers and entreaties. He is so fascinated by the work that he intends to take his father's place and carry on the system of excavation. He may think me a foolish, credulous woman, but, Monsieur Poirot, I am afraid, supposing that the spirit of the dead king is not yet appeased. Perhaps to you I seem to be talking nonsense." "No, indeed, Lady Willard," said Poirot quickly. "I, too, believe in the force of superstition, one of the greatest forces the world has ever known." I looked at him in surprise. I should never have credited Poirot with being superstitious, but the little man was obviously in earnest. "What you really demand is that I shall protect your son? I will do my utmost to keep him from harm." "Yes, in the ordinary way, but against an occult influence? In volumes of the Middle Ages, Lady Willard, you will find many ways of counteracting black magic. Perhaps they knew more than we moderns, with all our boasted science. Now, let us come to facts, that I may have guidance. Your husband had always been a devoted Egyptologist, hadn't he?"
Yes, from his youth upwards. He was one of the greatest living authorities upon the subject. But Mr. Bleibner, I understand, was more or less an amateur. Oh, quite. He was a very wealthy man who dabbled freely in any subject that happened to take his fancy. My husband managed to interest him in Egyptology, and it was his money that was so useful in financing the expedition. And the nephew? What do you know of his tastes? Was he with the party at all? I do not think so. In fact, I never knew of his existence till I read of his death in the paper. I do not think he and Mr. Bleibner can have been at all intimate. He never spoke of having any relation. Who was the other member of the party? Well, there's Dr. Toswell, a minor official connected with the British Museum, Mr. Schneider of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, a young American secretary, Dr. Ames, who accompanies the expedition in his professional capacity, and Hassan, my husband's devoted native servant. Do you remember the name of the American secretary? Harper, I think, but I cannot be sure. He has not been with Mr. Bleibner very long, I know. He was a very pleasant young fellow. Thank you, Lady Willard. Is there anything else? For the moment, nothing. Leave is now in my hands, and be assured that I will do all that is humanly possible to protect your son. They were not exactly reassuring words, and I observed Lady Willard wince as he uttered them. Yet, at the same time, the fact that he had not pooh-poohed her fears seemed in itself to be a relief to her. For my part, I had never been before suspected that Poirot had so deep a vein of superstition as in his nature. I tackled him on the subject as we went homewards. His manner was grave and earnest. But yes, Hastings, I believe in these things. You must not underrate the force of superstition. What are we going to do about it? Toujours pratique, the good Hastings. Eh bien, to begin with, we are going to cable to New York for further details of young Mr. Bleiber's death. He duly sent off his cable. The reply was full and precise. Young Rupert Bleibner had been in low water for several years. He had been a beachcomber and a remittance man in several South Sea islands, but had returned to New York 2 years ago, where he had rapidly sunk lower and lower. The most significant thing to my eyes was that he had recently managed to borrow enough money to take him to Egypt. I have a good friend there I can borrow from, he had declared. Here, however, his plans had gone awry. He had returned to New York cursing his skinflint of an uncle, who cared more for the bones of dead and gone kings than his own flesh and blood. It was during his sojourn in Egypt that the death of Sir John Willard had occurred. Rupert had plunged once more into his life of dissipation in New York, and then, without warning, he had committed suicide, leaving behind him a letter which contained some curious phrases. It seemed written in a sudden fit of remorse. He referred to himself as a leper and an outcast, and the letter ended by declaring that such as he were better dead. A shadowy theory leapt into my brain. I had never really believed in the vengeance of a long-dead Egyptian king. Oh, yeah, I know. I had never really believed in the vengeance for a long-dead Egyptian king. I saw here a more modern crime. Supposing this young man had decided to go away with his uncle, preferably by poison. My mistake, Sir John Willard receives the fatal dose. Oh, by mistake. The young man returns to New York, haunted by his crime. The news of his uncle's death reaches him. He realizes how unnecessary his crime has been, and stricken with remorse, takes his own life. I outlined my solution to Poirot. He was interested. It is ingenious what you have thought of there. Decidedly it is ingenious. It may even be true, but you leave out of account the fatal influence of the tomb. I shrugged my shoulders. You still think that has something to do with it? So much so, mon ami, that we start for Egypt tomorrow. What? I cried, astonished. You have said it. An expression of conscious heroism spread over Poirot's face. Then he groaned. But, oh, he lamented, the sea, the hateful sea. I was just, here, put Maestro up. I was just thinking, I don't know if you have either read or seen the Death on the Nile, that the whole thing almost the whole thing takes place on a little cruise ship that's going down the Nile, and if he is seasick, then how in the world is he able to be on that cruise ship, I wonder? Maybe it's not as bad on the river? Who knows? Yeah. It hadn't really struck me before, and you see like the little hint at the beginning of the original Murder on the Orient Express. Yeah, probably, because, the water's not like choppy or anything like that. All right. Part 2. It was a week later. Beneath our feet was the golden sand of the desert. The hot sun poured down overhead. Poirot, the picture of misery, wilted by my side. Oh, that's true, yeah. The little man was not a good traveler. Our 4 days' voyage from Marseille had been one long agony for him. He had landed in Alexandria, the wraith of his former self. Even his usual neatness had deserted him. We had arrived in Cairo and had driven out at once to the Mena House Hotel, right in the shadow of the pyramids. The charm of Egypt had laid hold of me. Not so Poirot. Dressed precisely the same as in London, he carried a small clothes brush in his pocket and waged an unceasing war on the dust which accumulated on his dark apparel. "And my boots," he wailed. "Regard them, Hastings, my boots, of the neat patterned leather, usually so smart and shining. See, the sand is inside them, which is painful, and outside them, which is outrageous the eyesight. Also the heat, causes my mustache to become limp. But limp! Look at the Sphinx," I urged. "Even I can feel the mystery and the charm it exhales." Poirot looked at it discontentedly. It has not the air happy, he declared. "How could it have buried in sand in that untidy fashion? This cursed sand!" "Come now, there's a lot of sand in Belgium," I reminded him, mindful of a holiday spent at Knock-sur-Mer in the midst of les dunes impeccables, as the guidebook had phrased it. "Not in Brussels," declared Poirot. He gazed at the pyramids thoughtfully. "It is true that they, at least, are of solid shape and geometrical, but their surface is of an unevenness most unpleasing, and the palm trees, I like them not. Not even do they plant them in rows." I cut short his lamentations by suggesting that we should start for the camp. We were to ride there in camels, and the beasts were patiently kneeling, waiting for us to mount, in charge of several picturesque boys heading by a voluble dragoman. I pass over the spectacle of Poirot on a camel. He started by groans and lamentations, and ended by shrieks, gesticulations, and invocations of the Virgin Mary and every saint in the calendar. In the end, he descended ignominiously and finished the journey on the diminutive donkey. I must admit that a trotting camel is no joke for the amateur. I was stiff for several days. At last we neared the scene of the excavations. A sunburnt man with a grey beard, in white clothes and wearing a helmet, came to greet us. "Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings, we received your cable. I'm sorry that there was no one to meet you in Cairo. An unforeseen event occurred which completely disorganized our plans." Poirot paled. His hand, which had stolen to his clothes-brush, stayed in course. "Not another death," he breathed. "Yes." "Sir Guy Willard?" Sir Guy Willard?" I cried. "No, Captain Hastings, my American colleague, Mr. Schneider." "And the cause?" demanded Poirot. Tetanus." I blanched. All around me I seemed to feel an atmosphere of evil, subtle and menacing. A horrible thought flashed across me. Supposing I were next. "Mon Dieu," said Poirot in a very low voice. "I do not understand this. It is horrible. Tell me, monsieur, there is no doubt that it was tetanus?" "I believe not, but Dr. Ames will tell you more than I can do." "Ah, of course, you are not the doctor. My name is Toswell." This, then, was the British expert described by Lady Willard as being a minor official at the British Museum. There was something at once grave and steadfast about him that took my fancy. "If you will come with me," continued Dr. Toswell, "I will take you to Sir Guy Willard. He was most anxious to be informed as soon as you should arrive." We were taken across the camp to a large tent. Dr. Toswell lifted up the flaps and we entered. 3 men were standing inside. "Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings have arrived, Sir Guy," said Toswell. The voyage of the 3 men, the youngest of the 3 men jumped up and came forward to greet us. There was a certain impulsiveness in his manner which reminded me of his mother. He was not nearly so sunburnt as the others, and that fact, coupled with a certain haggardness round the eyes, made him look older than his 22 years. He was clearly endeavoring to bear up under a severe mental strain. He introduced his 2 companions, Dr. Ames, a capable-looking man of 30-odd, with a touch of graying hair at the temples, and Mr. Harper, the secretary, a pleasant, lean young man wearing the national insignia of horn-rimmed spectacles. After a few minutes' desultory conversation, the latter went on, and Dr. Toswell followed him. We were left alone with Sir Guy and Dr. Ames. "Please ask any questions you want to ask, Mr. Poirot," said Willard. "We are utterly dumbfounded at this a strange series of disasters, but it can't be anything but coincidence." There was a nervousness about his manner which rather belied the words. I saw that Poirot was studying him keenly. "Your heart is really in this work, Sir Guy?" "Rather. But no matter what happens, or what comes of it, the work is going on. Make up your mind to that." Poirot reeled round on the others. "What have you to say to that, Monsieur le Docteur?" "Well," drawled the doctor, "I'm not for quitting myself." Poirot made one of those expressive grimaces of his. "Then, évidemment, we must find out just how we stand. When did Mr. Schneider's death take place?" 3 days ago." "You're sure it was tetanus?" "Dead sure." "It couldn't have been a cause of strychnine poisoning, for instance?" "No, Monsieur Poirot, I see what you are getting at, but it was a clear case of tetanus." "Did you not inject antiserum?" "Certainly we did," said the doctor dryly. "Every conceivable thing that could be done was tried." "Had you the antiserum with you?" "No, we procured it from Cairo." "Have there been any other cases of tetanus in the camp?" "No, not one." "Are you certain that the death of Dr. Bleibner was not due to tetanus?" "Absolutely plumb certain. He had a scratch upon his thumb which became poisoned, and septicemia set in. It sounds pretty much the same to a layman, I dare say, but the 2 things are entirely different." "Then we have 4 deaths in total, dissimilar: 1 heart failure, 1 blood poisoning, 1 suicide, and 1 tetanus." "Exactly, Monsieur Poirot." "Are you certain there is nothing which might link the 4 altogether?" "I don't quite understand you." "I will put it plainly. Was any act committed by those 4 men which might seem to denote disrespect to the spirit of Menhera. The doctor gazed at Poirot in astonishment. You're talking through your hat, Monsieur Poirot. Surely you've not been guyed into believing all that fool talk. Absolute nonsense, muttered Willard angrily. Poirot remained placidly immovable, blinking a little out of his green cat's eyes. So you do not believe it, Monsieur le Docteur? No, sir, I do not, declared the doctor emphatically. I am a scientific man, and I believe only what science teaches. Was there no science, then, in ancient Egypt? Asked Poirot softly. He did not wait for a reply, and indeed Dr. Ames seemed rather at a loss for the moment. No, do not answer me, but tell me this. What do the native workmen think? I guess, Dr. Ames said, that where white folk lose their heads, natives aren't going to be far behind. I'll admit that they're getting what you might call scared, but they've no cause to be. I wonder, said Poirot noncommittally. Sir Guy leant forward. Surely, he cried incredulously, you cannot believe it. Oh, but the thing's absurd! You can know nothing of ancient Egypt if you think that. For answer, Poirot produced a little book from his pocket, an ancient tattered volume. As he held it out, I saw its title, The Magic of the Egyptians and Chaldeans. Then, wheeling round, he strode out of the tent. The doctor stared at me. What is his little idea? The phrase, so familiar on Poirot's lips, made me smile as it came from another. I don't know exactly, I confessed. He's got some plan of exorcising the evil spirits, I believe. I went in search of Poirot and found him talking to the lean-faced young man who had been the late Dr. Bleibner's secretary. No, Mr. Harper was saying, I've only been 6 months with the expedition. Yes, I knew Mr. Bleibner's affairs pretty well. Can you recount to me anything concerning his nephew? He turned up here one day, not a bad-looking fellow. I'd never met him before, but some of the others had. Ames, I think, and Schneider. The old man wasn't at all pleased to see him. They were at it in no time, hammer and tongs. Not a cent, the old man shouted. Not 1 cent now or when I'm dead. I intend to leave my money to the furtherance of my life's work. I've been talking it over with Mr. Schneider today, and a bit more of the same. Young Bleibner lit out for Cairo right away. Was he in perfectly good health at the time? The old man? No, the young one. I believe he did mention that there was something wrong with him, but it couldn't have been anything serious, or I should have remembered. One thing more. Has Mr. Bleibner left a will? So as far as we know, he is not. Are you remaining with the expedition, Mr. Harper? No, sir, I am not. I'm for New York as soon as I can square up things here. You may laugh if you like, but I'm not going to be this blasted Menhera's next victim. He'll get me if I stop here. The young man wiped the perspiration from his brow. Poirot turned away. Over his shoulder he said with a peculiar smile, Remember he got one of his victims in New York. Oh, hell! Said Mr. Harper forcibly. That young man is nervous, said Poirot thoughtfully. He is on the edge, but absolutely on the edge. I glanced at Poirot curiously, but his enigmatical smile told me nothing. In company with Sir Guy Willard and Dr. Toswell, we were taken round the excavations. The principal finds had been removed to Cairo, but some of the tomb furniture was extremely interesting. The enthusiasm of the young baronet was obvious, but I fancied that I detected a shade of nervousness in his manner, as though he could not quite escape from the feeling of menace in the air. As we entered the tent which had been assigned for us, for a wash before joining the evening meal, a tall, dark figure in white robes stood aside to let us pass with a graceful gesture and a murmured greeting in Arabic. Poirot stopped. You are Hassan, the late Sir John Willard's servant? I served my lord Sir John, now I serve his son. He took a step nearer to us and lowered his voice. You are a wise one, they say, learned in dealing with evil spirits. Let the young master depart from here. There is evil in the air around us. And with an abrupt gesture, not waiting for a reply, he strode away. Evil in the air, muttered Poirot. Yes, I feel it. Our meal was hardly a cheerful one. The floor was left to Dr. Toswell, who discoursed at length upon Egyptian antiquities. Just as we were preparing to retire to rest, Sir Guy caught Poirot by the arm and pointed. A shadowy figure was moving amidst the tents. It was no human one. I recognized distinctly the dog-headed figure I had seen carved on the walls of the tomb. My blood froze at the sight. Mon Dieu, murmured Poirot, crossing himself vigorously. Anubis, the jackal-headed, the god of departing souls. Someone is hoaxing us, cried Dr. Toswell, rising indignantly to his feet. It went into your tent, Harper, muttered Sir Guy, his face dreadfully pale. No, said Poirot, shaking his head, into that of Dr. Ames. The doctor stared at him incredulously. Then, repeating Dr. Toswell's words, he cried, Someone is hoaxing us! Come, we'll soon catch the fellow. He dashed energetically in pursuit of the shadowy apparition. I followed him, but search as we would, we could find no trace of any living soul having passed that way. We returned, somewhat disturbed in mind, to find Poirot taking energetic measures in his own way to ensure his personal safety. He was busily surrounding our tent with various diagrams and inscriptions which he was drawing in the mud. I recognized the 5-pointed star as pentagon many times repeated. As was his wont, Poirot was at the same time delivering an impromptu lecture on witchcraft and magic in general. White magic as opposed to black, with various references to the Ka and the Book of the Dead thrown in. It appeared to excite the liveliest contempt in Dr. Toswell, who drew me aside, literally snorting with rage. Balderdash, sir, he exclaimed angrily. Sure balderdash. The man's an impostor. He doesn't know the difference between the superstitions of the Middle Ages and the beliefs of ancient Egypt. Never have I heard such a hopscotch of ignorance and credulity. I calmed the excited expert and joined Poirot in the tent. My little friend was beaming cheerfully. We can now sleep in peace, he declared happily, and I can do with some sleep. My head, it aches abominably. Oh, for a good tisane. As though in answer to prayer, the flap of the tent was lifted, and Hassan appeared, bearing a steaming cup which he offered to Poirot. It proved to be chamomile tea, a beverage of which he is inordinately fond. Having thanked Hassan and refused his offer of another cup for myself, we were left alone once more. I stood at the door of the tent some time after undressing, looking out over the desert. A wonderful place, I said aloud. And a wonderful work. I can feel the fascination. This desert life, this probing into the heart of a vanished civilization. Surely, Poirot, you too must feel the charm. I got no answer, and I turned a little annoyed. My annoyance was quickly changed to concern. Poirot was lying back across the rude couch, his face horribly convulsed. Beside him was the empty cup. I rushed to his side, then dashed out and across the camp to Dr. Ames' tent. "Dr. Ames!" I cried. "Come at once!" "What's the matter?" said the doctor, appearing in pajamas. "My friend, he's ill, dying. Chamomile tea. Don't let Hassan leave the camp." Like a flash, the doctor ran to our tent. Poirot was lying as I left him. "Extraordinary!" cried Ames. "Looks like a seizure, or what did you call about something? What did you say about something he drank?" He picked up the empty cup. "Only I did not drink it," said a placid voice. I turned in amazement. Poirot was sitting up on the bed. He was smiling. "No," he said gently, "I did not drink it. While my good friend Hastings was apostrophizing the night, I took the opportunity of pouring it, not down my throat, but into a little bottle. That little bottle will go to the analytic chemist. No?" as the doctor made a sudden movement. "As a sensible man, you will understand that violence will be of no avail. During Hastings' absence to fetch you, I have had time to put the bottle in safe keeping. Ah, quick, Hastings, hold him!" I understood Poirot's anxiety. Eager to save my friend, I flung myself in front of him, but the doctor's swift movement had another meaning. His hand went to his mouth, a smell of bitter almonds filled the air, and he swayed forward and fell. "Another victim," said Poirot gravely, "but the last. Perhaps it is best this way. He has 3 deaths on his hands." "Dr. Ames?" I cried, stupefied. "But I thought you believed in some occult influence." "You misunderstood me, Hastings. What I meant was that I believed in the terrific force of superstition. Once get it firmly established that a series of deaths are supernatural, and you might almost stab a man in broad daylight, and it would still be put down to the curse. So strongly is the instinct of the supernatural implanted in the human race. I suspected from the first that a man was taking advantage of that instinct. The idea came to him, I imagine, with the death of Sir John Willard. A fury of superstition arose at once. As far as I could see, nobody could derive any particular profit from Sir John's death. Mr. Bleibner was a different case. He was a man of great wealth. The information I received from New York contained several suggestive points. To begin with, young Bleibner was reported to have said he had a good friend in Egypt from whom he could borrow. It was tacitly understood that he meant his uncle, but it seemed to me that in that case he would have said so outright. The word suggests some boon companion of his. Another thing, he scraped up enough money to take him to Egypt. His uncle refused outright to advance him a penny, yet he was able to pay the return passage to New York. Someone must have lent him the money. "Oh, that was very thin," I objected. But there was more. Hastings, there occur often enough words spoken metaphorically which are taken literally. The opposite can happen too. In this case, words which were meant literally were taken metaphorically. Young Bleibner wrote plainly enough, "I am a leper," but nobody realized that he shot himself because he believed that he contracted the dread disease of leprosy. "What?" I ejaculated. It was the clever invention of a diabolical mind. Young Bleibner was suffering from some minor skin trouble. He had lived in the South Sea Islands, where the disease is common enough. Ames was a former friend of his and a well-known medical man. He would never dream of doubting his word. When I arrived here, my suspicions were divided between Harper and Dr. Ames, but I soon realized that only the doctor could have perpetrated and concealed the crimes, and I learned from Harper that he was previously acquainted with young Bleibner. Doubtless the latter, at some time or another, had made a will or had insured his life in favor of the doctor. The latter saw his chance of acquiring wealth. It was easy for him to inoculate Mr. Bleibner with the deadly germs. Then the nephew, overcome with despair at the dread news his friend had conveyed to him, shot himself. Mr. Bleibner, whatever his intentions, had made no will. His fortune would pass to his nephew, and from him to the doctor. And Mr. Schneider? We cannot be sure. He knew young Bleibner too, remember, and may have suspected something, or again, the doctor may have thought that a further death motiveless and purposeless would strengthen the coils of superstition. Furthermore, I will tell you an interesting psychological fact, Hastings. A murderer has always a strong desire to repeat his successful crime. The performance of it grows upon him. Hence my fears for young Willard. The figure of Anubis you saw tonight was Hassan dressed up by my orders. I wanted to see if I could frighten the doctor. But it would take more than the supernatural to frighten him. I could see that he was not entirely taken in by my pretenses of belief in the occult. The little comedy I played for him did not deceive him. I suspected that he would endeavor to make me the next victim. But in spite of la mer maudite, the heat abominable, and the annoyances of the sand, the little grey cells still functioned. Poirot proved to be perfectly right in his premises. Young Bleibner, some years ago, in a fit of drunken merriment, had made a jocular will, leaving my cigarette case you admire so much, and everything else of which I die possessed, which will be principally debts, to my good friend Robbert Ames, who once saved my life from drowning. The case was hushed up as far as possible, and to this day people talk of the remarkable series of deaths in connection with the tomb of Menhera as a triumphal proof of the vehemence of a bygone king upon the desecrators of his tomb. A belief which, as Poirot pointed out to me, is contrary to all Egyptian belief and thoughts. All right. And we will move right along to our final story of the day. Story number 7, The Great Robbery of the Grand Metropolitan. Poirot, I said, a change of air would do you good. You think so, mon ami? I'm sure of it. Eh? Said my friend, smiling. It is all arranged, then? You will come? Where do you propose to take me? Brighton. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine in the city put me on to a very good thing, and, well, I have money to burn, as the saying goes. I think a weekend at the Grand Metropolitan would do us all the good in the world. Thank you. I accept most gratefully. You have the good heart to think of an old man. And the good heart, it is in the end worth all the little grey cells. Yes, I who speak to you am in danger of forgetting that sometimes. I did not relish the implication. I fancy that Poirot was sometimes a little inclined to underestimate my mental capacities, but his pleasure was so evident that I put my slight annoyances aside. Then that's all right, I said hastily. Saturday evening saw us dining at the Grand Metropolitan in the midst of a gay throng. All the world and his wife seemed to be at Brighton. The dresses were marvelous, and the jewels, worn sometimes with more love of display than good taste, were something magnificent. And it is a good sight, this, murmured Poirot. This is the home of the profiteer, it is not so, Hastings? Supposed to be, I replied, but we'll hope they aren't all tarred with the profiteering brush. Poirot gazed round him placidly. The sight of so many jewels makes me wish I had turned my brains to crime instead of its detection. What a magnificent opportunity for some thief of distinction. Regard, Hastings, that stout woman by the pillar. She is, as you say, plastered with gems. I followed his eyes. Why, I exclaimed, Mrs. Opalson. You know her? Slightly. Her husband is a rich stockbroker who made a fortune in the recent oil boom. After dinner, we ran across the Opalsons in the lounge, and I introduced Poirot to them. Oh, hang on, Snoggings. Here, Snoggings. There we go. We have been joined by a gray tabby. After dinner, we ran across the Opalsons in the lounge, and I introduced Poirot to them. We chatted for a few minutes and ended by having our coffee together. Poirot said a few words in praise of some of the costlier gems displayed on the lady's ample bosom, and she brightened up at once. It's a perfect hobby of mine, Mr. Poirot. I just love jewelry. Ed knows my weaknesses, and every time things go well, he brings on something new. You are interested in precious stones? I have had a good deal to do with them one time and another, madame. My profession has brought me into contact with some of the most famous jewels in the world. He went on to narrate, with discreet pseudonyms, the story of the historic jewels of a reigning house, and Mrs. Opalson listened with bated breath. There now, she exclaimed as he ended. If it isn't just like a play, you know I've got some pearls of my own that have a history attached to them. I believe it's supposed to be one of the finest necklaces in the world. The pearls are so beautifully matched and so perfect in color. I declare I really must run up and get them. Oh, madame, protested Poirot, you are too amiable. Pray do not derange yourself. Oh, but I'd like to show it to you. The buxom dame waddled across the lift briskly enough. Her husband, who had been talking to me, looked at Poirot inquiringly. Madame, your wife is so amiable as to insist on showing me her pearl necklace, exclaimed the latter. Oh, the pearls! Opalson smiled in a satisfied fashion. Well, they are worth seeing. Cost a pretty penny, too. Still, money's there all right. I could get what I paid for them any day, perhaps more. May have to, too, if things go on as they are now. Money's confoundedly tight in the city. All this infernal EPD, he rambled on, launching into technicalities where I could not follow him. He was interrupted by a small page boy who approached him and murmured something in his ear. What? I'll come at once. Not taken ill, is she? Excuse me, gentlemen. He left us abruptly. Poirot leaned back and lit one of his tiny Russian cigarettes. Then, carefully and meticulously, he arranged the empty coffee cups in a neat row and beamed happily on the result. The minutes passed. The Opalsons did not return. Curious, I remarked at length. I wonder when they will come back. Poirot watched the ascending spiral of smoke and then said thoughtfully, They will not come back. Why? Because, my friend, something has happened. What sort of thing? How do you know? I asked curiously. Poirot smiled. A few minutes ago the manager came hurriedly out of his office and ran upstairs. He was much agitated. The lift boy is deep in talk with one of the pages. The lift bell has rung 3 times, but he heeds it not. Thirdly, even the waiters are distrait. And to make a waiter distrait, Poirot shook his head with an air of finality. The affair must indeed be of the great magnitude. Ah, it is as I thought. Here come the police. 2 men just entered the hotel, one in uniform, the other in plain clothes. They spoke to a page and were immediately ushered upstairs. A few minutes later, the same boy descended and came up to where we were sitting. Mr. Opalson's compliments, and would you step upstairs? Poirot sprang nimbly to his feet. One would have said that he awaited the summons. I followed with no less alacrity. The Opalsons' apartments were situated on the 1st floor. After knocking on the door, the page boy retired when we answered the summons. So I think that in this case, like the 1st floor would be in the U.S. What we would say floor 2. So there's the ground floor and then the 1st floor and 2nd and so on. So I think that's what it is. Yes, because he said, would you step upstairs? All right. The Opalsons' apartments were situated on the 1st floor. After knocking on the door, the page boy retired and we answered the summons. Come in. A strange scene met our eyes. The room was Mrs. Opalson's bedroom, and in the center of it, lying back in an armchair, was the lady herself, weeping violently. She presented an extraordinary spectacle, with the tears making great furrows in the powder with which her complexion was liberally coated. Mr. Opalson was striding up and down angrily. The 2 police officials stood in the middle of the room, one with a notebook in hand. An hotel chambermaid, looked frightened to death, stood by the fireplace, and on the other side of the room, a Frenchwoman, obviously Mrs. Opalson's maid, was weeping and wringing her hands with an intensity of grief that rivaled that of her mistress. Into this pandemonium stepped Poirot, neat and smiling. Immediately, with an energy surprising in one of her bulk, Mrs. Opalson sprang from her chair towards him. I always love how they think that fat people are going to be really cumbersome. I myself am apparently very light-footed for one of my girth. They have commented a lot, like, I was in a few plays about 5 or 10 years ago, and I just remember the choreographers were always like, "You're just so light on your feet," surprised as if that were a strange thing. We get a bad rap, we fat people, sadly. Anyways, rant over. There now, Ed may see what he likes, but I believe in luck I do. It's fated I should meet you the way I did this evening, and I've a feeling that if you can't get my pearls back from me, nobody can. Calm yourself, I pray of you, madame. Poirot patted her hand soothingly. Reassure yourself. All will be well. Hercule Poirot will aid you. Mr. Opalson turned to the police inspector. There will be no objections to my calling in this gentleman, I suppose? Not at all, sir, replied the man civilly, but with complete indifference. Perhaps now your lady's feeling better, she'll just let us have the facts. Mrs. Opalson looked helplessly at Poirot. He led her back to her chair. Seat yourself, madame, and recount to us the whole history without agitating yourself. Thus abjured, Mrs. Opalson dried her eyes gingerly and began. I came upstairs after dinner to fetch my pearls for Mr. Poirot here to see. The chambermaid and Celestine were both in the rooms as usual. Excuse me, madame, but what do you mean by as usual? Mr. Opalson exclaimed, I make it a rule that no one is to come into this room unless Celestine the maid is there also. Chambermaid does the room in the morning while Celestine is present, and comes in after dinner to turn down the beds under the same conditions. Otherwise she never enters the room. Well, as I was saying, continued Mrs. Opalson, I came up, went to the drawer here, she indicated the bottom right-hand drawer of the knee-hole dressing table, took out my jewel case and unlocked it. It seemed quite as usual, but the pearls were not there. The inspector had been busy with his notebook. When did you last see them? He asked. They were there when I went down to dinner. You are sure? Quite sure. I was uncertain whether to wear them or not, but in the end I decided on the emeralds and put them back in the jewel case. Who locked up the jewel case? I did. I wore the key on a chain round my neck. She held it up as she spoke. The inspector examined it and shrugged his shoulders. The thief must have had a duplicate key. No difficult matter. The lock is quite a simple one. What did you do after you locked the jewel case? Put it back in the bottom drawer where I always keep it. You didn't lock the drawer? No, I never do. My maid remains in the room till I come up, so there's no need. The inspector's face grew grayer. Am I to understand that the jewels were there when you went down to dinner, and that since then the maid has not left the room? Suddenly, as though the horror of her own situation for the first time burst upon her, Celestine uttered a piercing shriek, and flinging herself upon Poirot, poured out a torrent of incoherent French. The suggestion was infamous, that she should be suspected of robbing Madame. The police were well known to be of a stupidity incredible. But Monsieur, who was a Frenchman, a Belgian, interjected Poirot, but Celestine paid no attention to the correction. Monsieur would not stand by and see her falsely accused, while that infamous chambermaid was allowed to go scot-free. She had never liked her, a bold, red-faced thing, a born thief. She had said from the first that she was not honest, and had kept a sharp watch over her, too, when she was doing Madame's room. Let those idiots of policemen search her, and if they did not find Madame's pearls on her, it would be very surprising. Although this harangue was uttered in rapid and virulent French, Celestine had interlarded it with a wealth of gesture, and the chambermaid realized at last a part of her meaning. She reddened angrily. "If that foreign woman's saying I took the pearls, it's a lie," she declared heatedly. Ugh. "I never so much as saw them." "Search her," screamed the other. "You will find it is as I say." "You are a liar, do you hear?" said the chambermaid, advancing upon her. "Stole them yourself, and want to put it on me. Why, I was only in the room about 3 minutes before the lady came up, and then you were sitting here the whole time, as you always do, like a cat watching a mouse." The inspector looked inquiringly at Celestine. "That true? Did you leave the room at all?" "I did not actually leave her alone," admitted Celestine reluctantly, "but I went into my own room through the door here twice, once to fetch a reel of cotton, and once for my scissors. She must have done it then." "You wasn't gone a minute," retorted the chambermaid angrily. "Just popped out and in again. I'd be glad if the police would search me. I've nothing to be afraid of." At this moment there was a tap at the door. The inspector went to it. His face brightened when he saw who it was. "Ah," he said, "that's rather fortunate. I sent for 1 or 2 female searchers, and she's just arrived. Perhaps if you wouldn't mind going into the room next door." He looked at the chambermaid, who'd stepped across the threshold with a toss of her head, the searcher following her closely. The French girl had sunk sobbing into a chair. Poirot was looking round the room, the main features of which I have made clear by a sketch. And there is a sketch. "Where does that door lead?" he inquired, nodding his head toward the one by the window. "Into the next apartment, I believe," said the inspector. "It's bolted anyway, on this side." Poirot walked across to it, tried it, then drew back the bolt and tried again. "And on the other side as well," he remarked. "Well, that seems to rule out that." He walked over to the windows, examining each of them in turn. And again, nothing, not even a balcony outside. "Even if there were," said the inspector impatiently, "I don't see how that would help us, if the maid never left the room." "Évidemment," said Poirot, not disconcerted, "as mademoiselle is positive she did not leave the room." He was interrupted by the appearance of the chambermaid and the police searcher. "Nothing," said the latter laconically. "I should hope not, indeed," said the chambermaid virtuously, "and that French hussy ought to be ashamed of herself taking away an honest girl's character." There, my girl, that's all right," said the inspector, opening the room. "Nobody suspects you. You go along and get on with your work." The chambermaid went unwillingly. "Going to search her?" she demanded, pointing at Celestine. Yes. He shut the door on her and turned the key. Celestine accompanied the searcher into the small room in her turn. A few minutes later she also returned. Nothing had been found on her. The inspector's face grew graver. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to come along with me all the same, miss." He turned to Mrs. Opelson. "I'm sorry, madame, but all the evidence points this way. If she's not got them on her, they're hidden somewhere about the room." Celestine uttered a piercing shriek and clung to Poirot's arm. The latter bent and whispered something in the girl's ear. She looked up at him doubtfully. Si, mon enfant, I assure you it is better not to resist." Then he turned to the inspector. "You permit, monsieur, a little experiment, purely for my own satisfaction." "Depends on what it is," replied the police officer noncommittally. Poirot addressed Celestine once more. "You have told us that you went into your room to fetch a reel of cotton. Whereabouts was it?" "On top of the chest of drawers, monsieur." And the scissors? They also? Would it be troubling you too much, mademoiselle, to ask you to repeat those two actions? You were sitting there with your work, you say? Celestine sat down, and then, at a sign from Poirot, rose, passed into the adjoining room, took up an object from the chest of drawers, and returned. Poirot divided his attention between her movements and the large turn-up of a watch which he held in the palm of his hand. Again, if you please, mademoiselle. At the conclusion of the second performance, he made a note in his pocket-book and returned the watch to his pocket. Thank you, mademoiselle, and you, monsieur? He bowed to the inspector, for your courtesy. The inspector seemed somewhat entertained by this excessive politeness. Celestine departed in a flood of tears, accompanied by the woman and the plainclothes official. Then, with a brief apology to Mrs. Opelson, the inspector set to work to ransack the room. He pulled out drawers, opened cupboards, completely unmade the bed, and tapped the floor. Mr. Opelson looked on skeptically. You really think you will find them? Yes, sir, it stands to reason. She hasn't time to take them out of the room. The ladies discovering the robbery so soon upset her plans. No, they're here right enough. One of the two must have hidden them, and it's very unlikely for the chambermaid to have done so. More than unlikely, impossible. Oh, sorry. Who was it that was speaking? You really think you will find them? Yes, sir, it stands to reason. She hadn't time to take them out of the room. The ladies discovering the robbery so soon upset her plans. No, they're here right enough. One or two must have hidden them, and it's very unlikely for the chambermaid to have done so. More than unlikely, impossible, said Poirot quietly. Eh? The inspector stared. Poirot smiled modestly. I will demonstrate. Hastings, my good friend, take my watch in your hand with care. It is a family heirloom. Just now I timed mademoiselle's movements. Her first absence from the room was of 12 seconds, her second of 15. Now observe my actions. Mademoiselle will have the kindness to give me the key of the jewel case. Madame will have the kindness. I thank you. My friend Hastings will have the kindness to say, go. Go, I said. With almost incredible swiftness, Poirot wrenched open the drawer of the dressing table, extracted the jewel case, fitted the key in the lock, opened the case, selected a piece of jewelry, shut it, and locked the case, and returned it to the drawer, which he pushed to again. His movements were like lightning. Well, mon ami? He demanded of me breathlessly. 46 seconds, I replied. You see? He looked round. There would have not been time for the chambermaid even to take the necklace out, far less hide it. Then that settles it on the maid, said the inspector with satisfaction, and returned to his search. He passed into the maid's bedchamber next door. Poirot was frowning thoughtfully. Suddenly he shot a question at Mr. Opelson. This necklace, it was without doubt insured? Mr. Opelson looked a trifle surprised at the question. Yes, he said hesitantly. It is so. But what does that matter? broke in Mrs. Opelson tearfully. It's my necklace I want. It was unique. No money could be the same. I comprehend, madame, said Poirot soothingly. I comprehend perfectly. To la femme, sentiment is everything. Is it not so? But monsieur, who has not the so fine susceptibility, will doubtless find some slight consolation in the fact. Of course, said Mr. Opelson rather uncertainly. Still, he was interrupted by a shout of triumph from the inspector. He came in dangling something from his fingers. With a cry, Mrs. Opelson heaved herself up from her chair. She was a changed woman. Oh, my necklace! She clasped it to her breast with both hands. We crowded round. Where was it? Demanded Opelson. Maid's bed? In among the springs of the wire mattress. She must have stolen it and hid it there before the chambermaid arrived on the scene." "You permit, madame?" said Poirot gently. He took the necklace from her and examined it closely, then handed it back with a bow. "I am afraid, madame, you will have to hand it over to us for the time being," said the I'm afraid, madame, you will have to hand it over to us for the time being," said the inspector. "We shall want it for the charge, but it shall be returned to you as soon as possible." Mr. Opalson frowned. "Is that necessary?" "I'm afraid, sir, just a formality." "Oh, let them take it, Ed," cried his wife. "I'd feel safer if he did. I shouldn't sleep a wink thinking someone else might try to get hold of it. That wretched girl, and I would never have believed it of her. There, my dear, don't take on so." I felt a gentle pressure on my arm. It was Poirot. "Shall we slip away, my friend? I think our services are no longer needed." Once outside, however, he hesitated, and then, much to my surprise, he remarked, "I should rather like to see the room next door." The door was not locked, and we entered. The room, which was a large double one, was unoccupied. Dust lay about rather noticeably, and my sensitive friend gave a characteristic grimace as he ran his finger round a rectangular mark on a table near the window. "The service leaves to be desired," he observed dryly. He was staring thoughtfully out of the window, and seemed to have fallen into a brown study. "Well?" I demanded impatiently. "What did we come in here for?" He started. "Je vous demande pardon, mon ami." I would ask pardon. "I wish to see if the door was really bolted on this side also." "Well?" I said, glancing at the door which communicated with the room we'd just left. "It is bolted." Poirot nodded. He still looked to be thinking. "And anyways," I continued, "what does it matter? The case is over. I wish you'd had more chance of distinguishing yourself. But it was the kind of case that even a stiff-backed idiot like that inspector couldn't go wrong over." Poirot shook his head. "The case is not over, my friend. It will not be over until we find out who stole the pearls." "But the maid did." "Why do you say so?" "Why," I stammered, they were found, actually, in her mattress." "Ta, said Poirot impatiently. "Those were not the pearls." "What?" "Imitation, mon ami." The statement took my breath away. Poirot was smiling placidly. "The good inspector obviously knows nothing of jewels, but presently there will be a fine hullabaloo." "Come!" I cried, dragging at his arm. "Where?" "We must tell the Opalsons at once." "I think not." "But that poor woman." "Yeah, that poor woman, as you call her, will have a much better night believing the jewels are to be safe. But the thief may escape with them." "As usual, my friend, you speak without reflection. How do you know that the pearls Mrs. Opalson locked up so carefully tonight were not the false ones, and that the real robbery did not take place in a much earlier date?" "Oh," I said, bewildered. "Exactly," said Poirot, beaming. "We start again." He led the way out of the room, paused a moment as though considering, and then walked down to the end of the corridor, stopping outside the small den where the chambermaids and valets of the respective floors congregated. Our particular chambermaid appeared to be holding a small court there, and to be retailing her late experiences to an appreciative audience. She stopped in the middle of a sentence. Poirot bowed with his usual politeness. "Excuse that I derange you, but I shall be obliged to you if you will unlock for me the door of Mr. Opalson's room." The woman rose willingly, and we accompanied her down the passage again. Mr. Opalson's room was on the other side of the corridor, its door facing that of his wife's room. The chambermaid unlocked it with her pass-key, and we entered. As she was about to depart, Poirot detained her. One moment, have you ever seen among the effects of Mr. Opalson a card like this? He held out a plain white card, rather highly glazed and uncommon in appearance. The maid took it and scrutinized it carefully. No, sir, I can't say I have. But anyway, the valet has most to do with the gentleman's room. I see, thank you. Poirot took back the card. The woman departed. Poirot appeared to reflect a little. Then he gave a short, sharp nod of the head. Ring the bell, I pray you, Hastings. 3 times for the valet. I obeyed, devoured with curiosity. Meanwhile, Poirot had emptied the waste-paper basket on the floor and was swiftly going through its contents. In a few moments the valet answered the bell. To him Poirot put the same question and handed him the card to examine, but the response was the same. The valet had never seen a card of that particular quality among Mr. Opalson's belongings. Poirot thanked him, and he withdrew, somewhat unwillingly, with an inquisitive glance at the overturned waste-paper basket and the litter on the floor. He could hardly have helped overhearing Poirot's thoughtful remark as we bundled the torn papers back again. And the necklace was heavily insured. "Poirot!" I cried. "I see you see nothing, my friend." He answered quickly. "As usual, nothing at all. It is incredible, but there it is. Let us return to our own apartment." We did so in silence. Once there, to my intense surprise, Poirot effected a rapid change of clothing. "I go to London tonight," he explained. "It is imperative." "What?" "Absolutely. The real work, that of the brain, those little grey cells. It is done. I go to seek the confirmation. I shall find it. Impossible to deceive Hercule Poirot." "You'll come a cropper one of these days," I observed, rather disgusted by his vanity. "Do not be enraged, I beg you, mon ami. I count on you to do me a service of your friendship." "Of course," I said eagerly, rather ashamed of my moroseness. "What is it?" "The sleeve of my coat that I have taken off. Will you brush it? See you, a little white powder has clung to it. You without doubt observed me run my fingers round the drawer of the dressing-table?" "No, I didn't." "You should observe my actions, my friends. Thus I obtained the powder on my fingers, and being a little overexcited, I rubbed it on my sleeve, an action without method which I deplore, false to all my principles." "But what was the powder?" I asked, not particularly interested in Poirot's principles. "Not the poison of the Borgias," replied Poirot with a twinkle. "I see your imagination mounting. I should say it was French chalk." "French chalk?" "Yes, the cabinet makers use it to make drawers run smoothly." I laughed. "You old sinner, I thought you were working up to something exciting." "Au revoir, my friend," I saved myself. "I fly." The door shut behind him. With a smile, half of derision, half of affection, I picked up the coat and stretched out my hand for the clothes-brush. Part 2. The next morning, hearing nothing from Poirot, I went out for a stroll, met some old friends, and lunch with them at their hotel. In the afternoon we went for a spin. A punctured tire delayed us, and it was 8:30 when I got back to the Grand Metropolitan. The first sight that met my eyes was Poirot, looking even more diminutive than usual, sandwiched between the Opalsons, beaming in a state of placid satisfaction. "Mon ami Hastings," he cried, and sprang to meet me. "Embrace me, my friend. All has marched to a marvel." Luckily, the embrace was merely figurative, not a thing one is always sure of with Poirot. "Do you mean," I began. "Just wonderful, I call it." "Just wonderful, I call it," said Mrs. Opalson, smiling all over her fat face. "Didn't I tell you, Ed, that if he couldn't get back my pearls, nobody would?" "You did, my dear, you did, and you were right." I looked helplessly at Poirot, and he answered the glance. My friend Hastings is, as you say in England, all at the seaside. Seat yourself, and I will recount to you all the affair that has so happily ended. I think all at the seaside means his mind is on vacation. Ended? But yes, they were arrested. Who were arrested? The chambermaid and the valet. Parbleu! You did not suspect? Not with my parting hint about the French chalk? You said cabinet makers used it. Certainly they do, to make drawers slide easily. Somebody wanted the drawer to slide in and out without any noise. Who could that be? Obviously only the chambermaid. The plan was so ingenious that it did not once leap to my eye, not even to the eye of Hercule Poirot. Listen, this was how it was done. The valet was in the empty room next door, waiting. The French maid leaves the room. Quick as a flash, the chambermaid whips open the drawer, takes out the jewel case, and, slipping back the bolt, passes it through the door. The valet opens it at his leisure with the duplicate key, with which he has provided himself, extracts the necklace, and awaits his time. Celestine leaves the room again, and psst, in a flash the case is passed back again and replaced in the drawer. Madame arrives, the theft is discovered, the chambermaid demands to be searched with a good deal of righteous indignation, and leaves the room without a stain on her character. The imitation necklace with which they have provided themselves had been concealed in the French girl's bed that morning by the chambermaid. A master stroke, la ça. But what did you go to London for? You remember the card? Certainly it puzzled me, and puzzles me still. I thought... I hesitated delicately, glancing at Mr. Opalson. Poirot laughed heartily. Une blague, for the benefit of the valet. The card was one with a specially prepared surface for fingerprints. I went straight to Scotland Yard, asked for our old friend Inspector Japp, and laid the facts before him. As I had suspected, the fingerprints proved to be of two well-known jewel thieves who have been wanted for some time. Japp came down with me, the thieves were arrested, and the necklace was discovered in the valet's possession. A clever pair, but they failed in method. Have I not told you, Hastings, at least 36 times, that without method at least 36,000 times, I interrupted. But where did this method break down? Mon ami, it is a good plan to take a place as chambermaid or valet, but you must not shirk your work. They left an empty drawer undusted, and therefore, when the man put down the jewel case on the little table near the communicating door, it left a square mark. Remember, I cried. Before I was undecided. Then I knew. There was a moment's silence. And I've got my pearls, said Mrs. Opalson, as a sort of Greek chorus. Well, I said, I'd better have some dinner. Poirot accompanied me. This ought to mean kudos for you, I observed. Ought it to, replied Poirot tranquilly. Japp and the local inspector will divide the credit between them. But, he tapped his pocket, I have a check here from Mr. Opalson, and how do you say, my friend, this weekend has not gone according to plan. Shall we return here next weekend, at my expense this time? All right, we just ran a little bit over, but that's all right. So we're halfway through the book, and I think next week we'll do, like we did this week, Monday with 3 stories and Wednesday with 4, and it will be, of course, the same time, 2 to 4 Pacific time. And then after that, we're going to start our holiday reads with Charles Dickens' The Haunted House, which, yes, that is actually a Christmas read. It takes place, I think it starts around like Christmas Eve, and then it's the 12 days of leading up to Epiphany afterwards, you know, the 12 days of Christmas sort of thing. And I'm really interested in seeing how
it plays out. Yeah, anyways, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream here. Usually I do a little bit of a game stream, but I have to start planning for tomorrow because I've got to sort of Frankenstein some recipes here. Let us see. Thanks for hanging out, Corral. Thanks for being here, and thanks for the bits. Let us see who is streaming right now. Do any of you have any... Ooh, nice. Any requests or suggestions for who we should raid? I know that Holly Swags is streaming. Coffee with B. Oh, thank you again for more cheers. I hope you do too. Even if it's just, you know, a day to hang out and chill in streams and stuff. Yes, we have Queer God is just chatting. What is she doing? There's Swags is, ooh, he's drinking wine, it looks like. Honey Crossing is playing Overwatch. Coffee with B is playing Animal Crossing. Yeah. Let's see, who should we raid? I haven't raided Honey with B in a while, or Coffee with B in a while. So we will. Oops. There we go. All right. Thank you again for hanging out with me. And I hope you guys have a good week. All the people in the U.S., if you are celebrating it, have a good Thanksgiving. And have a good weekend, everybody else. And I will see you next time. Thank you so much for the bits and the host and for just hanging out, UK. I always love seeing you. Bye.
I think I... What? Hello? Sunny, thank you so much for